control time, and you control... Among the many fantastical abilities in fiction, the power to manipulate time is consistently portrayed as one of the most powerful for many stories. But despite its narrative weight, some forms of time manipulation are deceptively simple to implement in video games. Time scale is an easily exposed variable in many game editors, so it's not difficult to create gameplay mechanics which change it. So if time manipulation mechanics are so easy to make, why are they so rare? Well, that has less to do with technical limitations and more to do with design ones. It is no exaggeration to say that letting a player control time requires the developers to change the world to accommodate that. More often than not, time control mechanics warp the entire design of a game's balance around their existence and create an assortment of design problems. This is the simplified answer. It usually isn't worth the effort to let players mess with time. Perfectly understandable, but that's boring. Game design isn't about avoiding every potential problem. It's also about identifying, assessing, and then throwing yourself headfirst into solving the problems which you got yourself into. Sometimes, whether something is worth it has less to do with dollars and time and more to do with grit and a touch of madness. If a developer is determined and/or crazy enough, they'll find ways to make their fantasy into reality. So, for those developers who did want to create the fantasy of controlling time, this video is about how they did it. Before we proceed, we need to explain a bit about the three perspectives to keep in mind when you play with time. The first is the player's perspective, in other words, real-world time. The second is the time controller's perspective. This is usually the player character, but some situations have the time powers be used by enemies or other parties. The third is the rest of the world's perspective. This is everything except the time controller, the environment, projectiles, enemies, allies, and so on. In other narrative mediums like books and movies, the viewer's perspective can follow either the time controller or the rest of the world, depending on what makes for better storytelling and dramatic tension. However, for games, time control should always be portrayed in ways which match the player's perspective. That means if an enemy stops time, the player character would get stopped, but the player should be shown everything that is done while time is stopped. This loses out on the narrative tension of not knowing what happened during the time stop, which is partially what makes such abilities overwhelming in stories. But such is the nature of different mediums. For games, clarity of information and a fair player experience are more important. With that out of the way, it's time to stop. Stopping time is the most direct use of this power. Its portrayal is the same across almost all media. Everything in the world stops except the user, who can move freely. This makes for an incredibly versatile narrative tool, which is also very simple for a reader to understand. In the hands of an antagonist, it can be a dominating force which makes them compelling to overcome. And in the hands of a protagonist, it offers many options but has enough limitations to allow for narrative creativity. However, when adapted into a game, time stop is a potential balancing nightmare. Functionally, it acts as a full-screen stun on all enemies, freezes all projectiles, pauses all stage movement, and lets the player take any action they want. This is exactly as overpowered as it sounds. It's an ability with near infinite utility and makes the player effectively unkillable while active, eliminating all possible game difficulty. Because of this, it's usually kept in check via inefficiency, ironically limiting it using real-world time. Activating it could have a high resource cost, there could be a long cooldown between uses, and it could only last a few seconds. This is the solution adopted by every fighting game adaptation of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. The world's time stop is the most iconic ability in the series, so it needs to be recreated in all its full glory. Activating the world causes its users' super meter to rapidly drain, and all its users have moves and abilities designed to take advantage of the time stop, such as Diego's projectiles and Dio's iconic yet slow Roll-the-Roller. The final result has enough applications to make it practical, but is kept balanced via an inefficient and exorbitant cost. Though in this case that didn't really matter, since every player wants to use it because it's really cool. Usefulness be damned. To add to the fun factor, the games go out of their way to add niche interactions which are accurate to the source material. If one player stops time, the other can do the same. They can input the command and get to move during the time stop. This interaction is almost never useful in any practical way, because very few characters can stop time. But it lets you reenact the famous scene where Jotaro and Dio fight each other during stopped time, and that's really cool. Axel Low from Guilty Gear Strive has a time stop which is a direct reference to JoJo's. His version is extremely brief, brief, lasting only 2 seconds, so it yields very little damage or combo potential. But it's practical due to its 2-step activation process, giving it a different set of situational use cases. The first input prepares it, and for the next 5 seconds, if a second input is made, the time stop activates instantly and is impossible to punish. In other words, the threat of the time stop is what makes it useful. Axel doesn't have to actually use it. It forces the opponent to do nothing but block for 5 seconds. Any other action leads to them getting stopped and subsequently hit. Since Axel is a ranged fighter, he has a lot of ways to take advantage of this threat. He can force the opponent to back off, aggressively pressure them himself with more attacks or his ranged grab, hit them to start a new combo, or just taunt to style on them. Of course, these limitations are only necessary for games featuring combat. Change the genre and context, and the limitations change accordingly. Shadow Generations' Chaos Control applies the mechanic to platformer game speedrunning. Being able to easily defeat enemies is inconsequential because general enemies aren't a threat in Sonic games anyway. Chaos Control's real value is that it pauses the stage timer, letting players cheat out better score times. This is kept in check by a limited number of pickups within the stage, letting the level designers use them as rewards for picking certain paths or succeeding at optional platforming challenges. In this context, the balancing is less about the duration or power and more about the scoring requirements and level design. Ghost Trick Phantom Detective has a fully unlimited time stop, but it's a puzzle game with no enemies to defeat, so there's no reason to restrict it. In fact, since it's one of the game's core puzzle-solving mechanics, restricting it will be outright antithetical to the user experience. In this context, combat isn't a factor at all, so the designer's focus lies on the puzzle design to ensure the solutions are not obtuse. An alternative option is to only stop time for a single target. The Final Fantasy series features time control as an easily accessible spell via the stop spell, which stops the target for a certain number of turns. This ends up being a glorified stun, which is boring. But there's probably no other real way to implement this into a turn-based game. What makes this approach interesting is if the stopped object receives the after effect of your interactions when the stop ends. This is what makes Breath of the Wild's stasis rune so much fun. It's intentionally unimpressive for direct combat because you can only lock one target at a time, and many strong enemies are immune to it. But it's a very fun tool for physics-based puzzle solving, and creative players can find many uses for it. Lastly, time stopping is very easy to showcase in cutscenes and cinematics, because these don't have any balance concerns at all. Despite the lack of gameplay, it can still impress players if it looks good enough, because this is one of those odd game mechanics that is more about presentation than practicality. Of course, every game technically includes a time stop. The pause button. Seriously, part of making a pause screen includes setting the game engine's timescale to 0 while it's active. This isn't exactly noteworthy unless a game decides to be meta and screw with the fourth wall for a laugh. Hades 2's villain, Kronos, does exactly this and will forcibly unpause your game to mock you for trying.
No, you do not control the flow of time. Not here.
See, this kind of stuff is why we love Supergiant. The next step down from stopping time is to slow it down. This is a variation of a bullet time mechanic, where time slows down for everything in the game, letting the player make decisions. The key difference is that the player character isn't slowed down like the rest of the game world and is able to move freely. This serves the same mechanical function as stopping time, extending reaction time. Both slow down projectiles, make enemies easier to dodge, and let players make extra button inputs and take extra actions. However, there is one additional variable which can be adjusted for balancing: the intensity of the slowness. This makes it more versatile as a mechanic to implement and design around, to the point where some games make it into a core mechanic, which ironically makes it more likely to warp a game's balance compared to a niche mechanic like a time stop. Enemy speed and player reaction time are both key metrics for a game's balance. Letting a player consistently slow them down heavily warps how a game is designed. Let's say you plan a standard encounter against a single enemy which shoots one projectile every 5 seconds. That's pretty easy to deal with. Now, make that 2 enemies. Sure, that's nothing. How about 3? Still pretty easy. Well, how about 5,000? At some point, the number of enemies becomes unreasonable for a standard encounter. Even if a player has enough health and damage to handle things, the game would feel unfair because the damage they take feels unpreventable or the encounter feels too intense. At regular time, 5 enemies might be overwhelming, but with time slowed down, a player might be able to handle 30 enemies. This limit differs based on factors such as the game's mechanics or the skill level of the target audience, but every game has one somewhere. It's important to have a good idea of what makes for acceptable difficulty to avoid overwhelming a player. Letting players slow down time blurs these limits. It's harder to estimate how difficult a challenge can be when a player can suddenly quadruple their reaction time on a whim. Mega Man 11's Speed Gear demonstrates this problem. The game focuses on both platforming and combat, and slowing down time by simply pressing a button trivializes many of the game's challenges and boss fights because they are designed to be clearable even without the slowdown. Inversely, Super Hot is designed entirely around the entire game being spent in a constant state of slowed time, and thus has a well-tuned and consistent difficulty and sense of progression. These are not impossible issues to design around. After all, part of a game designer's job is to estimate, playtest, and adjust the game's difficulty and overall experience. Changing time and speeds just adds another factor into the equation. The best way to limit this is through activation requirements and conditions. These can be utilized to keep the resource cost of the mechanic low enough to be accessible while still keeping limitations on it. Guilty Gear's Roman cancel mechanic is a universal cancel which lets a player assemble custom and otherwise impossible combos. It keeps the same amount of meter as the standard super, so it's readily accessible, but it is limited by a player needing to have the skill and knowledge to make that combo actually work. Donkey Kong Bonanza's time slow is tied to the snake transformation, which is otherwise quite clunky to move and fight in, limiting its usefulness to specific platforming sections. Bayonetta's Witch Time is a core feature of the series' combat system. While there are alternative ways to activate it, it is primarily triggered via making perfect dodges, rewarding players for skillful gameplay. Witch Time is brought along with Bayonetta's Smash Bros. Appearance as her down special counter and her final smash. Because Smash is a multiplayer party game, its use of time mechanics has to be even more limited than other examples. Unlike single-player games, the enemies subjected to the slowing effect aren't mindless computer NPCs, but real human players, meaning they'd feel pretty annoyed if it happens too often. As a result, Smash limits time control mechanics via rarity and unpredictability. Aside from Bayonetta, Dialga's Stage Hazard on Spear Pillar, the stopwatch item, and Shadow's Assist Trophy all also slow down time. But the rarity of these occurrences prevent them from being too annoying and make them difficult to reliably take advantage of. These next mechanics come as a pair: rewind and fast forward. These are typically minor puzzle mechanics which are commonly seen in RPG and adventure games. You know, stuff you encounter in dungeons or the overworld to make you rub a few brain cells together to spice up the exploration. These involve taking an object or scene and rewinding it to a previous state or fast-forwarding it to a future state to complete a puzzle. The catch is that it's pretty slow. Players need to be shown the full process of time reversing and passing, which is inherently slow and tedious, so that limits its use to gameplay applications which lack immediate time pressure. These types of puzzles are quite modular and fairly easy to plug into almost any game you want, very much a case where simplicity is strength. Still, depending on how extensive the game takes it, the exploration of this mechanic can range from self-contained puzzles like in Genshin and Star Rail to full game world interactions like in Tears to the Kingdom. There are a few rare cases of faster-paced games experimenting with the idea of a recall, which have a character instantly rewind themselves into their state from a few seconds ago. This requires the game to constantly keep track of a few of the character's key stats, such as HP, mana, ammo, and skill cooldowns, so that they can be reset to how those stats were upon the recall's activation. This is the gimmick used by Tracer in Overwatch and Echo in League of Legends and 2XKO. It ends up resembling a time-flavored take on a flash step or blink teleport, which are already existing genre conventions which MOBA and fighting game players will find familiar. These genres themselves are also the main reason reason why this recall mechanic was created to begin with. By itself, it doesn't have much depth, but it helps these characters stand out amidst their game's large playable rosters by giving them a unique playstyle and metagame role. It also mechanically ties into their characters' backstories, although which came first between the story idea or gameplay idea is a question of chicken and egg which only the developers truly know, so I'd rather not dwell on that for too long. Up next, we have skipping time by itself is almost worthless as a game mechanic. It isn't the same as stopping time and moving. Time still passes in the game world, but the player sees none of it, potentially leading to missing information and player confusion. Depending on context, this could range from anywhere from a few minutes to a day to a full week, which the player never sees. In fact, it's so awkward of an idea to implement that even JoJo doesn't bother. Despite Diavolo being one of the series' main villains, his King Crimson's time skip is adapted as a relatively standard counter mechanic. Apparently, even the fighting games don't bother trying to explain how King Crimson works. Time skipping only has value as a component of either a time loop or a time travel game structure. The former is the game structure pioneered and or popularized by Majora's Mask. It features a game world which automatically resets after enough time has passed in real life, usually because of a disaster at the end. The player needs to explore the game world, gather clues, solve mysteries, and find a way to prevent the disaster and break the loop. These can be very compelling adventure games due to their complexity. Their game worlds have to be small so that players have enough time to do everything important on their final run, but are filled with loads of depth due to interweaving side quests, NPCs, dungeons, and abilities which encourage uncovering new things in previously visited areas. And there is no real punishment for failure beyond a reset, so players are emboldened to experiment. In these games, time skipping is functionally used to reset the loop by skipping to the end when the player gets sent back to the start. The issue of missing information is negligible because it is presumed that nothing important happens for the remainder of the loop and everything gets reset anyway. The latter is less of a gameplay mechanic and more of a scene swapping system disguised as chronology. A straightforward example would be a past and future version of a map. Narratively, you are traveling through time, but mechanically you are just teleporting between two different maps. Ocarina of Time structures itself this way. Link has to switch between past and future versions of Hyrule, and changes made in one side affects the other. A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds reuses this structure with a light and dark world. So really, Ocarina's time travel is just narrative flavor. However, time travel doesn't have to be drastic. We don't need to pull a future Trunks story and try to change the past or visit the future.
Hold your fire! This man isn't black! What? It's Commander Trunks!
The scale can be a lot smaller, to the point of being single days. In this case, each day is a different version of the setting which contains different events and scenarios. Time skipping is used to switch between these days. The Persona series is structured around a calendar, with different events and social links taking place on different days. Different actions skip time forward in varying amounts, and multiple days may get skipped as part of story sequences. Pokemon Legends ZA features a day-night system. The layout of Lumio's city stays the same in both versions, but each has different Pokemon encounters and night mode activates the trainer battle zones. For those with the DLC, changing scenes also generates a new set of hyperspace zones. The day changes naturally after enough real-world time has passed, but players can skip time by resting on a bench or on your bed. However, these can't really be called time manipulation game mechanics. You don't just casually decide to structure your game around a calendar system or a past and future map change. Those are dictated by the game's narrative structure or high-concept design choices. It's more accurate to describe them as structural components instead. If I knew anything about architecture, I could probably make an analogy here. But I worked in game development and finance instead, so I'll delegate that to any architecture students in the comment section who happen to be watching this video for some reason. Either way, time skipping serves as a necessary function to make both the time loop and time travel game structures work. They aren't really mechanics, but I'm mentioning them to cover the remaining bases and because I'll likely never need to talk about this topic again after this video. Time may be something universal to all games, but as you can see, it's pretty rare to let players meddle with it directly. Letting players stop, slow, or skip through time brings many considerations which need to be addressed. Sometimes the game needs to be structured in a specific way to allow that to happen, sometimes it is done to create a specific fantasy, and sometimes it's done just because the developers thought it'd be cool, which it totally is. It might be a niche mechanic, but as with all mechanics, it can be pretty fun if it's executed well. And that's the most important thing in the end, having fun. So let us raise a glass to these games who do play with time and have a moment to appreciate what these devs have achieved. Now, to you, my dear viewer, try to think, have you ever played a game which dealt with time? How did they do it? What issues did you think they may have faced? And what solutions did they eventually take to solve those? What are your own thoughts on this niche yet entertaining mechanic? I look forward to reading what interesting responses we'll have. If you enjoyed the video, remember to leave a like so that the algorithm thinks I make good content and maybe go watch another one. Otherwise, have a good night.